Hello and welcome to the Polymath Thinking Academy. My name's Andrew Wadmer and I am the founder of the Academy. Now, at Polymath Thinking, we are here to teach apex wisdom, which is understanding the truth, utilizing multiple disciplines, multiple sectors of knowledge, and I will explain a bit about that. History is very, very important as part of this process. It's absolutely critical, in fact, because it casts a shining light on all of the other disciplines which are absolutely critical. Now, in the last millennia, the last 1,000 years, essentially, we have seen a lot of change in the Western Hemisphere with the rise of Europe out of the Dark Ages, and that's very, very important. The three volcanoes that kicked off the Dark Ages in the 6th century AD, starting around 530 AD. And we've seen the rise of a great deal of technology, and that rate of technological increase and development has only heightened year on year for the last 1,000 years, coming out of the Dark Ages. However, prior to that, there is a great deal of history that needs to be understood, and without that, it's very hard to understand the world around us. So from the United Kingdom of Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, across to America, Canada, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and the Americas, there's a great deal that we can talk about in the last 1,000 years. However, as I say, there's a great deal we can understand in terms of the new technology, the new science that we've discovered in the last 1,000 years as well. And it's very important because we're effectively talking about 1 following 2, following 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 in mathematics. That is the logic of mathematics. However, it's very different when you come to human interactions, human behavior, human heuristics, which have so ably been revealed to us by the likes of Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and more recently Richard Thaler. Now, a good example of polymath thinking, apex wisdom, and where it's necessary, is in dealing with historical facts, historical events that are very, very important, but that are not easy to understand in their entirety. And if you don't understand them in their entirety, then of course there's a problem. Because a first glance, a first look at these historical events will not tell you what you need to know. A lot of the last 500 years of human history has been involved with financial developments, especially developments around the use of gold and currencies, in commerce, and competition between powers, including great powers, over these issues. So we'll start with one simple example that provides a lot of information about polymath thinking. Most of us are aware in the 19th century, the early 19th century, of the machine smashers in England, in Lancashire, in wool country there, where the advent of steam-powered looms meant that a lot of people were going to lose their jobs. And a handcraft was going to move to a machine-orientated form of industry. And this is interesting. From this time, and the concept of General Ludd, Ned Ludd, who may well have been a fictitious character made up, we get the term Luddite. And that's someone who doesn't understand, or certainly doesn't like technology and technological innovation. And we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment. However, there is the assertion that a clergyman, William Lee, went to the Queen of England at the time in 1589, who was Queen Elizabeth I, and showed a loom that could make clothes with less human labour. And it is asserted that Queen Elizabeth I said that while it was a very good idea, she didn't want to utilise it because it would put people out of work and it would create strife and disorder as a result. Now, current commentators in the 21st century have held differing views on this and said that Elizabeth I made a clear mistake here. That is what some commentators said, and others have said they've been neutral on the topic, and or they've said that it was probably a good idea that she didn't let it go forward. Now, it's reminiscent of the Governor of New South Wales in the mid-19th century in Australia telling Mr. Hargraves, who found gold first in Australia, that it would probably be a good idea if he didn't publicise it because it could create gold fever and set people, colonials, at each other's throats in the pursuit of gold. So it's that sort of concept that a massive change in value that can enrich a few can cause a great deal of trouble. However, if we go back to Elizabeth I in 1589, we need to remember that this was the year after the Spanish Armada. Sir Francis Drake, who had helped repel the Armada, and Sir Walter Raleigh, his nephew, were going hither and thither, finding opportunities for England, as it then was, in the New World, especially looking for gold and silver bullion that could finance the treasury. And aside from this, in 1563 in England, under Elizabeth I, they had passed the Statute of Artificers, which essentially set up a maximum rate of pay for workers during 6 months of the year that included spring and summer and autumn, so not during winter, that encouraged workers to create materials and commodities and finished goods and products that could be sold overseas in return for money in the form of gold and silver coins that would then enrich the English nation, which needed strong commerce, and would help them pay for other things that they needed in times of crisis. The concept being that if you had a strong economy where you had a good balance of payments and you had holdings in gold and silver, coins and bullion, then in times of crisis or war you could pay for food and weaponry. That's the general concept, although it hasn't been stated as succinctly as that because of a lack of polymath thinking. Now, essentially what that means is that Elizabeth I had seen a lot of change already by 1589, and therefore she was highly unlikely to be persuaded to give a patent to William Lee for his machine loom. And of course, it was the monarch who handed out patents, so exclusive rights, monopolistic rights to produce this product. Importantly, there were guilds at the time that dealt with the quality of goods, anything from ale to woolen products. And it's likely that the presence of these guilds and then the lack of presence of these guilds in the future has had a lot to do with the way industry has gone, even though this has not been highlighted as an important issue going into the future. But it is one worth remembering that guilds are very important for business, as distinct from just having unions that help for workers. Now, the important point about this is that at the time of 1589, the great powers of Europe were essentially interested in finding bullion and as much of it as they could in the New World, in the Americas, and they were pursuing that with great vigor, all of them. And in 1581, the Emperor of China had sought taxation to be provided in the form of silver bullion, and that meant that they would not receive, he would not take tribute in-kind products or paper currencies. 3 o'clock is fine. 3 o'clock. And as a result, there was a great need for more silver bullion to be produced so that China could run its economy on that silver bullion currency and medium of exchange. That being said, that dynasty only lasted another 60 years, pointing to the fact that administration and financial administration of empires was highly problematic and needed to be managed in a much better way. And that would become the story of the next 500 years that we are still living now. But moving on from 1589 and Elizabeth I not giving William Lee his patent for his machine loom. In about 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte in France had by now been seeking new sources of commerce in order to strengthen France, post-revolutionary France. And the first big opportunity that he had come across was what was known as the Jacquard loom, essentially a machine loom. As a result, the English response with steam-powered looms was likely to be very, very important as a competitive response to what Napoleon had made with his loom. Essentially, if France was using new techniques to produce more fabric, then Britain needed to do the same, so that there wasn't a commercial advantage that could lead into a greater strategic advantage through France making more products and outcompeting the British Empire, as it then was. However, while there was a great deal of turmoil over the use of machine looms to make fabric, the more important part to be cognizant of is that these machine looms became the forerunners of computers, or the analytical engines that was pioneered by a variety of people, but most notably Charles Babbage. Now, why is this important? Well, currently we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, changing the way we do things, and that's very, very important. But while textile workers were put out of work by the machine looms, that was not the main issue that we remember, although sometimes it is put forward as the main issue that came out of the machine looms. By far the greater issue is the use of those early looms in providing the concepts for a computer, starting with a mechanical computer and then following decades later with computers in the next century using electricity and recording things not on cards, paper cards, but on silicon chips and circuits and memory boards. Now recently, Dr. Brett Weinstein and Dr. Heather Heying covered off this issue in the 314th Evolutionary Lens podcast, the Dark Horse podcast that they run. Dr. Weinstein and Dr. Heying are both world-renowned and brilliant evolutionary biologists. And in this topic where they spoke about William Lee and his bid to get a patent for his invention from Elizabeth I in 1589, they pointed that as being a clear case of an opportunity missed and a mistake on the part of the Queen. Now that certainly makes sense in some ways, logical ways. However, in the historical context of the year before being the Spanish Armada, and the fact that you had the Statute of Artificers as a piece of legislation, Tudor legislation, from 1563, and the mercantilism of that bill, and Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, it actually makes sense, if indeed Elizabeth I did turn down the clergyman William Lee, that actually was a very good idea. In terms of the machine smashers of the early 19th century, in England, while you can understand textile workers being unhappy, the reality is there was a great power competition on between France and England in terms of fabric, and now it would appear we have the same great power competition for artificial intelligence, AI, between America and China, and the large language models and a variety of other things that can basically replace human labour. Briefly, before continuing, I think it's fair to say that human labour, while is very, very important, the reality is, as heuristics show us, humans do not want to do annoying tasks, and computers are more suited to doing them and doing them well. And therefore, we can rely on artificial intelligence to give us a lot of information about the way things work, without the human flaws of not wishing to appear not to know the answer to something, or not appearing to be perpetually curious, which of course humans are. And therefore AI principally allows us to sate our curiosity without becoming embarrassed. And these are two key things. Humans are primarily curious beings because of their need for information through the five senses. But by the same token, humans have pride and other human relationships that they wish to preserve, and hence they suffer from embarrassment, and they don't want to and can't sate that curiosity because of their concern that they will offend other humans, other people who they have relations with. So AI cuts through all of that, and it can do simple work as well, which the big hyperscalers are managing. Therefore, there is a story of abundance and a story of more jobs rather than less, not just more utility based on artificial intelligence. And it's important to be mindful of that. But polymath thinking allows us to look at situations like the ones that Dr. Weinstein and Dr. Hine pointed out, and see them in greater context and receive greater understanding as a result. Now, polymath thinking really starts at the beginning of the universe, although we can say things about what came before the universe. And it then allows us to go through history quite quickly, past the formation of the Earth as we know it now, in the solar system that we exist in. And it allows us to come down through the Archean geological phase, the Proterozoic geological phase, to the Cambrian geological phase, and then all of the geological phases in between, such as the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Carboniferous, right to the point where we meet human beings approximately 3 million years ago. And the story of humanity really starts there, especially in an evolutionary biological sense. Essentially, humanity as we know it, a lot of that history only starts about 100,000 years ago, then moving from the continent of Africa when people left and started inhabiting the whole world from Africa, where the first humans took a step. Essentially from there is a lot of information there is a lot of concepts we can talk about. From there, 50,000 years ago, to about 13,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. There's celestial events, supernova, there's a range of different things that have helped to push humanity in the direction that they have gone. However, a lot of that material can be flagged, signposted, but we can be most certain of the importance of the last 8,500 years of human history, because some dramatic events from there have led us to where we are now, starting with the Storegga tsunami in 6100 BC, which was a undersea landslide in Norway that created a tsunami that enveloped the east of Scotland and led to the loss of Doggerland between now England and Norway, where people had lived and hunted for thousands of years. And this dramatic change became an initial trauma for humanity that then was compounded by later floods, grand floods in the Middle East, and later tsunamis, including the tsunami in approximately 2600 BC that knocked out the temple civilization of Malta, the architects of the Hypogeum, the three-level mortuary complex. That is very interesting in its own right. Aside from ancient Egypt, which became combined under King Nama I, the first pharaoh in 3100 BC, which kicked off the Bronze Age and led to effectively 3 millennia of Egyptian greatness, with intermediate periods in the middle and droughts and famines, but that effectively led to an ongoing civilization that helped feed and direct Western civilization, and this forms a great deal of what we'll talk about in Polymath Thinking, because much of that history and society and cultural effect, philosophy and political effect still affects us today in the modern age, in the 21st century, in 2026 and beyond. Now, as I said in the beginning, gold has had a lot to do with our history in the last 500 years, as has financial management and financial issues. And as I stated, when talking about the Tudor age of Elizabeth I, a lot of what was being endeavoured and enterprised at the time was in the pursuit of more gold and silver bullion in order to bolster countries and great power competition. A lot of this gold came from the Americas, from Chile, Peru, Argentina, Ecuador, what is now Mexico. At the time it was Tenochtitlan, run by the Mexica, that had vast resources of gold. And of course, the Inca, who had a great deal of gold and who had subsumed the Chinú tribe who were gold workers to assist them. And the Spanish conquistadors were able to exploit that for their own benefit, although at great personal cost. Now, essentially, international trade flourished in the 17th century, in the 1600s, with Holland, the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch and the British all working very hard to develop their economies with new thinking, new business concepts, new trading concepts. But one very important inflection of history that's not really talked about very much, which is absolutely critical and may be one of the most critical inflection points of history in the last 500 years, was the creation of the Royal Society in Britain in approximately 1688. Because this scientific society was a place where thinkers with a scientific bent could come forward and could put forward their scientific views and formula to explain the world we see around us. Now, the Royal Society is mentioned as an ancient society, but it is not thousands of years old. It is not even 400 years old yet. It is just about 350 years old. But Sir Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet was able to do fundamental work there, as was Sir Isaac Newton, and a great deal of mathematics came forward as a result of this, and people were able to then take that mathematics and then extrapolate it into things like insurance contracts in the early 18th century, which was done by a group of Scottish mathematicians who created the Scottish Widows Society to pay for the widows of Scottish clergymen. And what's important about that is that they were so accurate, they were able to, in £58,000, they were able to calculate, predict, and resolve to create, down to the last pound, what was required in 25 years' time. So that was very, very important, and it showed the ability of the mathematics of the Royal Society, informing people to the extent that other mathematicians could take their work and use it with a high degree of accuracy in business, in insurance. And these innovations meant that Britain had a great deal to do with financial innovation, financial commerce, and it wasn't simply the creation of a longitudinal clock in 1752 that allowed you to work out wherever you were in the world with the H1 or H2 clock, as I recall. Now, why this is important is that whilst the Scots were able to create great insurance contracts, very successful, accurate insurance contracts out of the work of the Royal Society in London and Sir Edmund Halley, by the time 1717 came around, Sir Isaac Newton had suffered mercury poisoning in the 1690s, and he made a mistake with the silver price that meant that people didn't use coins with a nominal face value that it had on it. They fused coins together into bullion because the bullion, silver bullion, was worth more as bullion than the nominal face value stamped on the coin by the mint, because of a mistake that Isaac Newton made. The net result was that silver was devalued and the gold standard effectively was set in motion from that point, because the bullionists in the early 19th century, like David Ricardo, suggested that this was necessary. David Hume and the great Adam Smith came decades afterwards, but by that time the gold problem had been put into effect and the gold standard was only shut in 1971 by President Richard Nixon, who stopped the convertibility, because under the Bretton Woods system, people or countries could convert their currency into US dollars and then the US dollars into gold. And that wasn't viable in a long-term sense. What's interesting, a bit more than 50 years on, is that there seems to be a new de facto gold standard coming into being through people holding gold and rebalancing into gold, a more than $30 trillion gold market being extant at the moment, because people are holding not just fiat currencies, paper currencies, but digital assets, shares, bonds, loans, all manner of paper assets. And human beings require diversity to steady their nerves, despite the fact that John Maynard Keynes described gold as a barbarous and even useless relic. It's very easy to look at that at the time and call it that, but the reality is the writing has been on the wall for gold for 10,000 years that it is a store of value. It basically is the source of value. Gold created value. Gold created value as a concept, as a thing. Gold came before value. Gold was the progenitor of value. And a lot of that has to do with gold coming from the celestial event, the kilonova, two neutron stars slamming together, and about 5% of that matter being ejected as energy, and neutron-rich materials like gold, silver, platinum, palladium, uranium, that sort of thing. So that is how the gold atom is created in a celestial event, a very violent one, and we know that from an observation that was made in 2017, first noted by LIGO, the gravitational wave detector, and then of course because light and radio waves travel slower than gravitational waves because of the effect of gravity, telescopes were able to look in the direction of the neutron star merger and actually see it in the optical wavelength, the Roy G. Biv nanometer, 300 to 700 nanometer spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's this ethereal, beautiful quality, heavy quality of gold that in many ways, and silver, that gives them their value, but gold especially, that weighs the same as tungsten. Now, from ancient Egypt and their use of gold to buy silver and cedar, from Lebanon and the Sinai Peninsula and the tribes around there, in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom under Cheops, Khufu, the son of Senefru, through the port of Wadi al-Jaf, all the way down through the Middle Kingdom, Tutmosis III, and their transactions with Byblos, the Phoenicians, their acquisition of native copper to make tooling that allowed them to build the pyramids, because copper can be remolded and retooled very quickly and sharpened every hour, as the Egyptians did, unlike steel or iron, which the ancient Egyptians didn't have at the time. Copper and gold have played a very important part in trade and commerce and created some of the regional tensions and religious and social tensions that we see today. In the New Kingdom, so the kingdom of Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, son of Seti I, we see great Egyptian success, but we also see the Hebrew tribes who came out of Semitic tribes working assiduously in ancient Egypt, because the ancient Egyptians didn't want to colonize other countries. And coming into the late Bronze Age collapse, 1200 to 1000 BC, we see more and more groups moving away from Egypt in Exodus-like movements. And around 1000 BC, you see the creation of the Davidic dynasty and his son Solomon by Bathsheba, who created King Solomon's mines that led to a great deal of wealth for the young Jewish state, and helped the flowering of the Jewish state at the time through the restructure of the copper mines of Timnah, owned and run by the Edomites, and King Solomon managed them for a percentage of the output that was very lucrative for him and the entire Jewish state, who had copper to trade with and cook with rather than just stone and wood. So the utility of the Jewish state went up because of their wealth and their access to copper for daily living. That's another key inflection point that people haven't understood. But from there, we move from a late Bronze Age collapse almost to a secondary Bronze Age collapse, because in a short period of time, in the 7th and 6th century BC, you saw multiple states fall, from the Assyrians to the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the state of Israel, and then the state of Persia, the kingdom of Persia, became embroiled in disputes that led ultimately to the Macedonians under Philip and Alexander the Great destroying the Persian Empire in the 330s BC. So whilst there was a great deal of promise in the East, a lot of the promise got wiped out by very violent wars that dwarfed even what the Romans achieved in the Roman Empire in the West. Now in the West, in the Italian peninsula, you started with the Villanovans that became the Etruscans, the Etruscan Federation of 36 cities. The Latin Etruscans rebranded themselves in 509 BC as the Romans, as a Roman Republic, but this Roman Republic failed quite quickly after only 3 centuries because of a violent and unnecessary conflict with Carthage, that while Rome won and Carthage lost, the Roman Republic system itself was a casualty, and the Roman Republic system ended up being wiped out along with Carthage, and only Rome, under the military dictators that then became triumvirates, and then the Empire of Rome took over. But Carthage and the Roman Republican system did not make it. and arguably the Roman Republic was destroyed at Cannae by Hannibal when 2 consuls were defeated on consecutive days and the Roman army was wiped out in 216 BC. So there's a great deal to talk about in polymath thinking, apex wisdom, and the Polymath Thinking Academy seeks to undertake this and show you the truth of history that has the ability to reduce confusion, ignorance, but also, more importantly, anxiety through not understanding the world we live in, because with our 5 senses, the human beings are nothing if not conscious creatures who need information and need understanding of the world around them in order to thrive and to avoid as much anxiety and pain as possible through having a good understanding of the world they live in. And that's what we aim for at the Polymath Thinking Academy.